The rhythmic clack of keys on his ergonomic keyboard was the loudest sound in Reid's cubicle, a monotonous percussion that had defined his days for the better part of a decade. He was an analyst, his work a precise, unyielding dissection of data streams, a task that demanded meticulous attention but offered little in the way of surprise or spontaneity. His life, in many ways, mirrored his work, predictable, ordered, a carefully catalogued existence within the confines of his small apartment and the bustling, indifferent city that surrounded it. He moved through his routine like a well-oiled machine, each action calibrated, each thought accounted for. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was safe. It was known. Then came the letter. Not an email, not a text, but a heavy cream envelope, sealed with an unfamiliar wax stamp, delivered by a uniformed courier who seemed as out of place in Reid's sterile office building as a forgotten relic. The address was handwritten in an elegant, looping script that felt impossibly old-fashioned. He tore it open with a vague sense of irritation, expecting a charity solicitation or an obscure legal notice. Instead, the formal script within informed him of the sudden, mysterious death of a distant relative he barely remembered, a great-aunt's cousin twice removed, a woman named Elara. Reid recalled a faded photograph, a stern face framed by a severe bun, from some long-forgotten family gathering. The letter went on, in stiff, legalistic prose, to name him as the sole beneficiary of Elara's estate. Specifically, a cabin. A secluded, ancient cabin nestled deep within a forgotten forest, somewhere far from the city's grid. Reid reread the words, a peculiar hollowness settling in his stomach. He hadn't known Elara, not really. Their connection was a fragile thread woven through generations, barely perceptible. Why him? The question echoed in his mind, sharp and insistent. The letter offered no answers, only instructions for a legal representative to contact him. He stared at the city skyline from his office window, the concrete and glass stretching into the hazy distance. His life here, with its predictable rhythms and quiet comforts, suddenly felt flimsy, insubstantial. The thought of a cabin, ancient and isolated, felt like a jarring note in a carefully composed symphony. A sense of obligation, faint but persistent, began to stir within him. Perhaps it was a chance to understand a fragment of his own lineage, a branch of the family tree that had withered from neglect. Or perhaps, he admitted to himself, it was the sheer, terrifying novelty of it all that pulled him. The unknown, for the first time in years, was beckoning. The journey began 2 weeks later, after a series of terse phone calls with a solicitor whose voice was as dry and brittle as parchment. Reid packed sparingly, his usual practical efficiency tinged with an unfamiliar apprehension. The landscape shifted, the ordered rows of suburban homes dissolving into sprawling fields, then into increasingly dense stands of trees. Hours into the drive, the asphalt narrowed, becoming a ribbon of cracked pavement that snaked deeper into the wilderness. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of pine and rich, dark earth. He passed through a small, nondescript border checkpoint, a solitary booth manned by a uniformed official who barely glanced at Reid's identification before waving him through. Beyond that point, the last vestiges of civilization seemed to fall away entirely. The road became gravel, then little more than a dirt track, winding through towering, ancient trees whose branches laced together overhead, creating a perpetual twilight. The forest here was unlike anything Reid had ever experienced. It wasn't merely quiet, it was listening. He drove with a growing sense of unease, the canopy overhead growing thicker, the light dimming to a bruised purple even though the sun had yet to fully set. The air grew still, the breeze that had accompanied him for miles now absent, replaced by a stagnant, earthy breath that smelled of decay and something else he couldn't quite place, something metallic, like old pennies. He checked the coordinates on his phone, the signal fading in and out with alarming regularity. He was close. The track finally opened into a small, overgrown clearing, and there it stood. The cabin. It was older than he had imagined, its timber walls a deep, weathered gray, almost black in the failing light. A stone chimney, crumbling at the top, leaned precariously. Reid cut the engine. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. He sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The air inside the car felt suddenly thin, difficult to draw into his lungs. He felt exposed, fragile, as if he had driven into a pocket of time where the rules of his ordered world no longer applied. The cabin wasn't merely old, it felt alive, in a way that stirred a primal unease deep within him. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. And whatever occupied it, he instinctively knew, was not welcoming. That life, however, was now a receding echo. The old sedan, packed to the brim, ate up the miles of asphalt, leaving the ordered grid of the city behind. The further he drove, the more the landscape surrendered its manicured edges, giving way to an untamed expanse of towering pines and tangled undergrowth. He passed the border checkpoint just before noon, a brief, sterile interaction with a uniformed officer who barely glanced at his identification before waving him through. The checkpoint felt less like a gateway and more like a final barrier, separating the world he knew from the one he was about to enter. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense foliage, painting the forest floor in shifting mosaics of gloom and fleeting brightness. He found the cabin just as the map indicated, a squat, timber structure hunkered down in a small clearing, looking less built and more grown from the very soil it occupied. Its windows, dark and vacant, seemed to stare out from beneath heavy brows of moss-laden eaves. A plume of wood smoke, thin and pale, curled lazily from the stone chimney, the only sign of recent habitation. The relative, a distant cousin whose name Reid could barely recall, had left this place, and its secrets, to him. The first few hours were a blur of unpacking and reluctant exploration. The interior was dim, smelling of dust, aged timber, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang that Reid couldn't quite place. He lit the oil lamps, their soft glow pushing back the encroaching shadows, revealing walls lined with rough-hewn logs and a stone hearth large enough to stand in. That evening, as the last sliver of twilight bled from the sky, the cabin began its subtle work. A distinct thump from the upper floor sent a jolt through him, making him pause mid-sentence in the book he was trying to read. He listened, straining. Only the hiss of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl answered. Settling, he thought, forcing the explanation. Old houses make noise. He tried to dismiss the prickle that ran up his spine. The next morning, a half-empty mug of coffee, which he distinctly remembered placing on the small wooden table beside the hearth, sat instead on the mantelpiece, a good 6 feet away. He stared at it, then at the table, then back at the mug. He was tired, perhaps more so than he realized, and the change of routine was disorienting. He must have moved it himself, distracted, and simply forgotten. He picked it up, the ceramic cool against his fingers, and carried it back to the table. The incident, minor as it was, left a faint, nagging question in the back of his mind. Later, while attempting to organize the small, cluttered pantry, he heard it again. He froze, a ladle still in his hand. The sound continued, a quiet, persistent rasp. A mouse, he reasoned, picturing a small creature gnawing at the ancient timbers. He even called out, a soft, "Hey there," hoping to scare it off. The scratching stopped abruptly. He waited, his breath held, but it didn't resume. That afternoon, he began clearing out a small, dusty study off the main living area. It was crammed with forgotten relics, yellowed maps, strange, crudely carved wooden figures that resembled distorted human forms, and stacks of brittle, leather-bound books. One particular shelf, tucked away behind a heavy, moth-eaten tapestry, seemed to house only a single, unassuming wooden box. It was unlatched, almost inviting. Inside, nestled amongst layers of faded velvet, lay a collection of tarnished silver lockets and a small, leather-bound journal. The journal was thick, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with an elegant, spidery script in faded ink. Reid pulled it out, feeling its unexpected weight. The cover was plain, unadorned, save for a single, deeply incised symbol that looked like a tangled knot of roots and bones. He sat at the dusty desk, pushing aside a dried, pressed flower, and opened the journal. The first few pages were mundane, recording weather patterns and crop yields, but then the entries shifted. The language grew archaic, fragmented, filled with unsettling references to the old ones and the reckoning. He found a passage detailing a pact, hinting at a payment, a sacrifice, made to ensure the land's favor. As he read, a distinct sound echoed from the far end of the room, the creak of a floorboard, as if someone had just shifted their weight. Reid's head snapped up. The study was empty. The sound had been too clear, too specific, to be merely the house settling. He looked down at the journal, the strange symbol on its cover seeming to pulse faintly in the dim lamplight. The seed of doubt, planted days ago, had begun to sprout. Or so he'd thought. It began subtly, the way a hairline fracture might appear on a solid surface. A faint, earthy scent, like damp soil and decaying leaves, would waft through his cubicle, momentary and elusive, gone before he could fully register it. He'd blame it on a faulty vent, a colleague's forgotten lunch, anything to dismiss the anomaly. Then came the whispers, indistinct and fleeting, just at the edge of his hearing. Not words, not exactly, but a soft, sibilant murmur, like wind through dry reeds, that seemed to emanate from the empty space behind his monitor. He'd spin around, but there was only the beige partition, the muted office light. The shift from vague unease to undeniable intrusion occurred one Tuesday afternoon. He was reviewing a particularly dense spreadsheet, his focus absolute, when the temperature in his cubicle plummeted. A sudden, piercing cold, not the gentle draft of air conditioning, but an icy breath that raised gooseflesh on his arms. And then he saw it. A ripple in the air, directly in front of him, just above his keyboard. It was like heat haze rising from asphalt on a summer day, but it shimmered with an unnatural, greenish tint, distorting the fluorescent light into a swirling vortex. He stared, unblinking, his breath catching in his throat. The ripple expanded, stretching wider, until it seemed to engulf the entire space of his desk, the edges of his monitor blurring, his fingers on the keyboard appearing to waver and distort. His mind screamed for an explanation, fatigue, a trick of the light, a transient migraine. He snatched his hand back from the keyboard, the motion breaking the spell. He sat there, trembling, his analysis forgotten. He couldn't dismiss it anymore. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a conduit. The phenomena weren't confined to its weathered walls, they were reaching for him, bleeding into his everyday reality. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The methodical precision that made him a good analyst now focused on a different kind of data. His research began with the most accessible information: public land records, local historical societies' online archives, and genealogical databases. He started with the cabin itself, tracing its ownership back through generations. The records were sparse, often handwritten and faded, hinting at a history that was either poorly documented or deliberately obscured. He learned the cabin had indeed been in his family for centuries, passing down through an obscure branch, always to the most distant, most solitary relative. His recently deceased relative, the one he barely knew, was just the latest in a long line. The land itself proved more difficult to investigate. Maps from the early 19th century showed the area around the cabin as largely uncharted wilderness, marked with ominous, archaic script that spoke of unsettled territory and dense forest. Local legends, found in digitized newspaper clippings from the late 1800s, were more revealing. One particularly unsettling article detailed the inexplicable demise of a logging crew in the 1870s, their bodies found intact but withered, as if time had accelerated their decay by decades. The article concluded with a local elder's quote about respecting the old ways and the spirit of the land. Reid dug deeper, searching for anything connected to his family name and these strange occurrences. He found fragmented mentions of a specific ancestor, a man named Alastair Reid, who had been a surveyor in the late 1700s. Alastair's name appeared in several land deeds and property disputes, often involving vast, remote tracts of land, one of which was specifically described as being adjacent to the nascent demarcation line near the border checkpoint. The specific mention of the border checkpoint, a place of transit and often overlooked historical significance, piqued Reid's interest. Why would his ancestor, a surveyor, be so involved with land near such a sensitive location, far from the cabin? He tracked down an obscure historical society in a remote, forgotten town nestled deep in the mountains, a place that seemed to have stopped in time. They were rumored to possess an archive of early colonial land surveys, some of them still in their original, fragile bindings. Inside, the elderly archivist, a stoic woman with spectacles perched on her nose, seemed accustomed to the solitude. After a lengthy wait, she presented him with a heavy, leather-bound volume, its pages brittle with age. Its title, handwritten in elegant, looping script, read Surveyor Alastair Reid, Field Notes and Observations. As he carefully turned the delicate pages, a drawing caught his eye. The phrase "a pact made" echoed the family rumors he'd vaguely recalled from childhood, dismissed as morbid folklore. He wasn't just dealing with a haunting, he was dealing with a legacy, a debt. And it was becoming terrifyingly clear that he was the next installment. The cold in the archive deepened, a skeletal chill that seemed to seep not just from the stone walls but from the very air itself. Reid's fingers, already numb, traced the unsettling sketch of the cabin, the crude lines of the unset stones a stark counterpoint to the chilling phrase. Terrifying truth penned by his own lineage. He felt a profound shift within him, the easy dismissal of folklore crumbling under the weight of this raw, ancestral confession. He needed more. The scattered notes, half-finished sentences, and cryptic drawings were fragments of a nightmare. He scanned the shelves, his gaze now sharpened by a desperate hunger for answers. His eyes landed on the heavy stone hearth, a centerpiece of the room, its ancient, soot-stained bricks seeming to absorb all light. There was something about the way the bottommost stone on the right sat, just slightly askew, a fraction out of alignment with its neighbors. A trick of the light, perhaps, or a deliberate misdirection. He ran his fingertips along the mortar, finding a hairline crack, almost imperceptible. He pressed, then pushed, a faint grind of stone on stone. His breath hitched. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves and brittle parchment, lay a meticulously bound, leather-covered journal. Beside it, a single, rusted iron key, its teeth intricate and unfamiliar. He pulled them out, the air in the cavity smelling of earth, old paper, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood. He sat back on his heels, the journal heavy in his lap. The first page, brittle and yellowed, was filled with the same elegant, looping script as the previous notes, but the entries were far more extensive, more desperate. This was not a collection of fragments, this was a narrative, a confession spanning generations. The initial entries spoke of hardship. A forefather, facing ruin, crops failing, livestock perishing, a pervasive blight upon the land that starved his family and his settlement. Desperation, Reid read, had driven him to ancient practices, to pleas directed not to any god he knew, but to the very earth beneath his feet. And the earth, or something within it, had answered. A pact. Prosperity, abundance, protection from all ills, for the lineage, for the cabin, for the land itself. In return, a periodic offering. The nature of this offering was initially vague, shrouded in euphemisms of renewal and sustenance. But as Reid turned the pages, the language grew starker, the euphemisms stripped away by the forefathers' escalating horror. A life. A life from the bloodline, when the land demanded its due. The unset stones from the earlier notes were not just a boundary, they were a ritualistic perimeter, meant to contain, to appease, to focus the entity's hunger. The entity, the journal revealed, was not merely in the cabin, nor was it a ghost haunting the woods. It was the essence of the land itself, an ancient, consuming hunger that had been dormant for centuries, awakened and bound by the forefathers' desperate plea. It fed on the bloodline, growing stronger with each sacrifice, its tendrils reaching further, twisting reality around the cabin, making escape impossible for those it claimed. Reid's hands began to shake violently, the words blurring on the page. He was an heir not to property, but to a generational debt, a grotesque contract written in blood. The journal chronicled the forefathers' descent into madness, his futile attempts to break the pact. He had tried to flee, to take his family far from the hungry earth. One entry, scrawled in a frantic hand, detailed a desperate journey. The path twists. The trees mock. There is no escape. I tried to reach the border checkpoint, to leave this accursed land behind, but the road simply ended. Or perhaps it never began. He spoke of no road, no checkpoint, only endless forest. Reid felt a crushing weight of observation, as if the entity, now aware of his discovery, was assessing him, its next meal. The pact. The sacrifices. His lineage. He was next. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath. He had to leave. Now. The path twisted, just as the journal had warned. The trees seemed to shift, their familiar shapes morphing into gaunt, skeletal figures, their branches reaching, beckoning. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs screamed, until the forest seemed to close in entirely. Then, abruptly, the trees thinned. He burst into a clearing, gasping for air, only to freeze. The small booth was empty, its window a black, vacant eye. No sound of traffic, no sign of life. He had only run in a circle, straight into the trap. The cold in the archive was no longer just a chill, it was a profound, suffocating pressure, as if the very air was solidifying around him. He heard a faint, rustling whisper, like dry leaves skittering across stone, though no wind stirred. He stumbled back, knocking a heavy leather-bound volume from a shelf. It landed with a dull thud, scattering dust motes that shimmered briefly in the dim light before vanishing. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a guttural thrumming that resonated in his chest. It wasn't just in the room, it was in him, a discordant note plucked deep within his own bones. Reid's jaw tightened. He wouldn't cower. He'd come too far, felt too much, to simply surrender to an unseen threat. This was a challenge, a declaration. The cabin was alive, and it wanted him to know it. He turned on his heel, intent on finding a stronger light source, anything to push back the encroaching gloom. As he reached the doorway, a sudden, icy grip clamped around his ankle. He cried out, a raw, involuntary sound, and pitched forward. His head struck the doorframe with a jarring crack, sending a ripple of pain through his skull. Disoriented, he scrambled back, kicking wildly. There was nothing there. He pressed a hand to his throbbing temple, his fingers coming away slick with something warm. Blood. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, not entirely, but from a surge of desperate anger. This thing was playing with him, mocking him. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, and fled the archive. The main living area, usually a refuge of relative normalcy, now felt alien, its familiar furniture warped by the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. Grabbing his keys, Reid practically ran to his truck. The engine coughed, then roared to life, a welcome cacophony in the suffocating quiet. He shifted into reverse, gravel crunching under the tires, and sped down the winding, overgrown driveway. He drove faster, desperate to outrun the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Miles melted away, or so he thought. The familiar landmarks, a leaning fence post, a distinctive cluster of pines, the sudden dip in the road, began to repeat themselves. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. He'd seen that fallen oak before, the one with the lightning scar. He had passed it at least 3 times. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling. No signal. Of course. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. There had to be a way out. He remembered a small, dilapidated gas station a good distance away, near a rarely used highway that led towards a border checkpoint. It was a long shot, but it was a way. He turned the truck around, determined to break free of this invisible cage. The drive was a blur of identical trees and repeating road signs. He pushed the truck to its limits, the engine groaning in protest. Just as despair began to curdle in his stomach, the dense forest finally broke, revealing a stretch of cracked asphalt and a low, squat building. The gas station. Relief flooded him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He pulled up to the single pump, killing the engine. The station looked abandoned. Dust coated the windows, and a faded closed sign hung crookedly on the door. He tried the handle anyway, it was locked. His hope deflated, but then he noticed a payphone, ancient and encrusted with grime, clinging to the wall. A payphone, in this day and age. It was a miracle. He fumbled in his pocket for change, his fingers clumsy with urgency. He found a few coins, inserted them, and dialed the number of the detective he'd spoken to briefly after his relative's death. The phone rang once, twice, a faint, metallic sound. On the third ring, a voice answered, but it wasn't the detective's. Reid whirled around. Standing in the doorway of the gas station, where the closed sign hung, was a figure. He stumbled backward, dropping the phone. The figure took a single, slow step forward. The air crackled with malevolence. Then, the world tilted. The gas station flickered, the asphalt beneath his feet rippled like water. The figure in the doorway wavered, its edges blurring. Reid blinked, hard. The station was gone. He was back on the winding, overgrown dirt road, the truck still idling, the forest pressing in on all sides. The gas station, the payphone, the figure, it had all been a cruel, elaborate illusion. He was trapped. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was in his mind, in the very fabric of the reality around him. His sacrifice. The profound, suffocating pressure in the archive had solidified Reid's resolve. He wouldn't simply endure this malevolence, he would fight it. He would escape. He needed to get out, to find help, to sever this ancient tie. He stumbled from the archive, past the unsettling portraits, and burst through the cabin's front door. The oppressive stillness of the forest pressed in immediately. A palpable weight. He tore across the small clearing, his boots crunching on fallen pine cones, and fumbled with the keys to the weathered pickup truck. It was old, a relic from his distant relative, and it coughed reluctantly to life, shuddering as he jammed it into gear. Towering firs and skeletal birches leaned inward, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the day. Reid gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, his eyes scanning the path for any sign of deviation. The landscape remained unchanging, a tunnel of green and brown, broken only by the occasional moss-covered boulder or a gnarled, deadfall tree. He started to recognize certain twisted branches, a peculiar cluster of fungi on a stump, landmarks he'd passed already. His stomach tightened. Was he driving in circles? He pushed the thought away, pressing harder on the accelerator. He remembered a vague mention from his relative's scattered notes about an old logging path that eventually intersected with a disused road, one that led, circuitously, to a distant border checkpoint. It was his only chance. The truck began to sputter, a harsh, mechanical cough that grew progressively weaker. Reid cursed, pumping the gas, but it was no use. The engine whined, then died with a final, defeated shudder. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the frantic drumming of his own heart against his ribs. He was stranded. He climbed out, slamming the truck door with a futile burst of anger. The forest loomed, a solid wall of indifference. He struck out through the undergrowth, pushing through thorny bushes and sinking into soft, damp earth. His determination warred with a rising tide of panic. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a presence, every snapping twig like footsteps. The branches seemed to reach for him, the roots to trip him. Before him, bathed in a sickly, gray light, stood the border checkpoint. It was just as he'd imagined, a small, dilapidated wooden hut, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, and a rusted metal barrier arm, long since fallen and half buried in the weeds. No vehicles, no guards, no sign of life. Reid stumbled towards the hut, his hopes plummeting even as he approached. He pushed open the creaking door. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light filtering through a grimy window. Inside, a narrow counter held a stack of yellowed papers and a thick, leather-bound logbook. He snatched it up, his fingers trembling, and flipped it open. The entries were sparse, mostly blank pages, faded ink documenting vehicle crossings from decades past. But then, on a page dated over a century ago, he saw it. Claimed to be called back. His breath hitched. He flipped more pages. Another read, this one from 60 years ago, with a similar note found wandering, incoherent. Spoke of the pact. His eyes darted, frantic. Claimed it wouldn't let him leave. Advised to seek help. Returned to the cabin. The last entry, below that, was a single, stark line, dated just yesterday. It was his own handwriting, shaky and uncertain, the letters strangely distorted as if written under duress. Reid tried to leave. It brought me back. Reid don't remember writing this. His own words, a confession he couldn't recall making. He wasn't just trapped, he was part of a cycle, a horrifying repetition. The entity hadn't just claimed the cabin, it claimed the entire forest, this stretch of forgotten land, and everyone in his lineage who dared to inherit it. He had tried to escape, and it had simply erased the attempt, twisting his mind, making him forget. His sanity, already stretched thin, began to unravel. He was a puppet, dancing on invisible strings, and the stage was this cursed, ancient forest. A cold dread, deeper than any chill, had settled within Reid. His own words, a confession he couldn't recall making, echoed in the silent cabin. The entity hadn't just claimed the cabin, it claimed the entire forest, this stretch of forgotten land, and everything that crossed its boundaries. His determination, however, was a brittle shield against the creeping terror. He would understand. He had to. The road, barely more than a rutted track, twisted through ancient pines whose boughs scraped at the sky, casting perpetual gloom. His destination was a desperate gamble, a place marked on an old, faded map he'd found tucked away in the cabin's attic, a border checkpoint, long abandoned according to the annotations, yet suspiciously prominent on the map. He clung to the hope that some forgotten record, some tangible evidence of the pact, might exist there, a place where the forest's influence might meet the remnants of the outside world. The air thickened as he drove deeper, becoming heavy and still, pressing against the truck's windows. He finally saw it, a stark, skeletal structure emerging from the tree line, the border checkpoint. It wasn't what he expected. Not a dilapidated shack, but a low, concrete building, weathered and stained, yet unnervingly intact. A heavy boom barrier, scarred with rust, lay across the road, a gate to nowhere. No lights. No signs of life. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, the sound amplified in the stillness. The checkpoint building had a single, narrow door, painted a faded, institutional green. It was a man, dressed in a faded uniform, the fabric stiff and old-fashioned. His face was gaunt, etched with lines that seemed less like wrinkles and more like patterns in ancient wood. His eyes, though fixed on Reid, held no light, no spark of recognition or curiosity. There was no question in his tone, only a flat statement of fact. Reid's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen the door open. "Who are you?" he managed, his own voice sounding impossibly loud. The official offered no name, no title. He simply tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "The crossing is closed. It has been, for many generations." He gestured with a skeletal hand towards the boom barrier. "But for those of the blood," the official replied, his gaze unwavering, boring into Reid. "A promise made when the land was young, when its heart still beat with untamed power. Your ancestors sought to harness it, to bind it for prosperity, for safety. A selfish desire, as all such desires are." Reid stumbled back a step, the gravel shifting beneath him. What pact? What was promised? A faint, mirthless smile touched the official's lips, stretching the dry skin of his face. Life for life. Consciousness for consciousness. A merging. Not death, not truly, but an assimilation. The forest remembers. The land hungers. It absorbs, it integrates. It becomes more. He lifted a hand, pointing a finger, long and thin like a root, towards the dense woods. The entity is not merely a spirit, Reid. It is the accumulated essence of your lineage, the consciousness of all who have fulfilled the pact. Every soul offered, every mind consumed, adds to its vast, silent awareness. It grows, it learns, it waits. Reid's mind reeled. Not a spirit, but a collective consciousness, a monstrous amalgamation fed by his own family. Your memories, your thoughts, your very identity. To become one with the land, one with the entity. Your ancestor promised a continuous tribute. A soul, from each generation, when the land calls. To strengthen it, to keep the balance. To prevent its untamed power from consuming all indiscriminately. The horrifying truth settled over Reid, a blanket of icy despair. The cycle wasn't just about haunting, it was about consumption, a forced, conscious merging into an ancient, vast, and terrifying being. He wasn't just losing his life, he was losing himself, his very existence dissolving into the collective consciousness of the forest. The sacrifice wasn't just dying, it was becoming it. There is no escaping the blood, the official continued, his voice now seeming to come from everywhere at once, the rustling leaves, the creaking trees, the very air. The land knows its own. It draws you back. He understood now. The entity wasn't something to be appeased with offerings or banished. With rituals. It was the pact, a living, growing consequence. And he was the next offering. He was the sacrifice. The world around him seemed to blur, the trees pressing in closer, their ancient boughs reaching, beckoning. The border checkpoint, once a symbol of escape, now felt like the very gateway to his obliteration. The world warped around Reid, not spinning, but folding in on itself, like a forgotten map crumpling under an invisible hand. The revelation had struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just observing the pact, he was the pact's conclusion. He was the next offering. A profound chill, deeper than any he had ever known, seeped into his core, yet it ignited a defiant spark. He wouldn't simply lie down and be consumed. He would fight. His mind, fractured moments ago, now sharpened with a desperate clarity. The tattered journal, the cryptic symbols, the whispers that had haunted the cabin, they weren't just portents, they were instructions. A ritual, a countermeasure, something to sever the twisted lineage that bound him. He stumbled back to the main room, his gaze sweeping over the dusty shelves, the forgotten heirlooms. The cabin was alive now, thrumming with a malevolent energy that vibrated in his bones. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, not from age, but from an unseen pressure. Reid could feel eyes on him, not physical eyes, but a pervasive, ancient awareness that seeped from the very walls. He found it in a locked drawer beneath a stack of his distant relatives' old ledgers, a small, wooden box, intricately carved with symbols that mirrored those in the journal. These were the tools, he realized, the anchors to whatever twisted magic had held this place captive. And with them, a final, unsettling entry in the journal, scrawled in a frantic hand to break the chain: one must offer what was taken. Not blood, but the passage. The basement. It had to be the basement. He placed the locket, the sprig, and the tooth upon the altar. His hands trembled, but his resolve held firm. The air grew denser, pressing in on him, making it difficult to breathe. Then, the true manifestation began. Reid was not alone. He heard the sound of countless voices, overlapping, indistinct, yet undeniably focused on him, a chorus of forgotten souls, of past sacrifices. The floor beneath his feet seemed to give way, not physically, but conceptually. He felt himself falling, not into a pit, but into an absence. He was suddenly standing on a barren, windswept plain under a sky the color of bruised plums. Before him loomed a structure, stark and imposing, a border checkpoint. Barbed wire fences stretched into the swirling mists on either side, and a heavy, rust-eaten gate stood ajar, leading into an impenetrable gloom. This was the passage the journal had spoken of. This was the entity's domain, the ultimate barrier. It was a mental construct, a psychological gauntlet designed to break him, to force him to accept his fate. But the spark of defiance flared hotter. He wouldn't. He looked at the locket, the sprig, the tooth on the invisible altar before him. He understood. The passage wasn't his passage to death, but the entity's passage out. He roared, a raw, primal sound that tore through his throat. He wasn't offering himself, he was offering them, the forgotten, the trapped, the endless chain of sacrifice. He was offering them a release. A searing pain lanced through his skull, as if invisible hands were tearing his mind apart. It showed him the lineage, an endless line of despair, ending with him. He staggered, blood trickling from his nose, his vision blurring. He was on the brink, his consciousness fraying. But he held on, his grip on the locket like a vice. He had to sever the chain. He was the sacrifice, yes, but not in the way the entity intended. He was the sacrifice that would end it all. With a final, desperate surge of defiance, he slammed his fist down onto the altar, shattering the locket, scattering the brittle sprig and the ancient tooth. The fragments glowed with a furious, blinding light. The border checkpoint imploded. Reid felt himself being ripped apart, his mind screaming, his body convulsing. He was consumed by an unbearable pressure, an agonizing release. The lantern was still out. The air in the cabin still tasted of ozone and something metallic, like old pennies left out in the rain. Reid lay sprawled on the floorboards, cheek pressed against the rough wood, the chill seeping into his bones. His muscles screamed with a dull, persistent ache that felt less like exhaustion and more like a systemic dismantling. Every breath was a shallow, careful thing, as if his lungs might collapse if he drew too deeply. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. The oppressive hum that had permeated every surface, every shadow, was gone. The air felt thin, empty, like a vacuum had been pulled through the space, sucking out not just the malevolence, but perhaps a piece of the cabin itself. He looked around. The invisible altar, the one that had held the locket, the sprig, The tooth, it was gone. Vanished. He fumbled at his pocket, his fingers finding the familiar, cold metal of the locket. It was still there. The sprig of dried herbs, too, crumpled but intact. But the tooth. The ancient, yellowed canine tooth was gone. He remembered the sickening crack, the way it had crumbled to dust the moment he had pushed the sprig of protective herbs against it, not to destroy it, but to break its hold, to sever the connection it represented. That was it. That was the understanding. The passage wasn't his. It was the entity's passage through his lineage, facilitated by the tooth, the physical anchor of the pact. By severing that anchor, by shattering the tooth, he hadn't destroyed the entity, not truly. He had merely cut the cord, broken its access point. And the cost. Reid ran a hand over his face. His skin felt strangely numb, yet hyper-aware. His vision swam at the edges, and a persistent, high-pitched whine echoed in his ears. He walked to the small, cracked mirror hanging near the door. His reflection stared back, gaunt and pale, eyes sunken. But there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmering at the edges of his form, like heat haze off a summer road. It was as if his very being had been stretched thin, transparent in places, barely holding together. He felt porous. The psychological toll was a crushing weight. The world seemed muted, colors faded, sounds muffled. He felt detached, observing his own actions as if from a great distance. The horror hadn't just been outside him, it had seeped in, altered the very fabric of his perception. The cabin was silent, yes, but the silence was a fragile veneer over an abyss he had glimpsed. He needed to leave. He gathered a few essentials, moving with the sluggishness of a deep-sea diver. His truck, miraculously, started on the first try, its engine a rough cough in the heavy forest air. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the cabin looming behind him, or worse, something else. The trees seemed to press in closer than before, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching, clinging. Hours later, the sun was a bruised purple stain on the horizon when Reid reached the border checkpoint. He slowed the truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. A uniformed agent, a woman with tired eyes and a pen tucked behind her ear, stepped out. He approached his window, his stride unhurried, almost bored. "Evening," he said, his voice flat. "Anything to declare?" Reid swallowed, his throat dry. "No. Just coming through." She peered into the cab, her gaze lingering on his face for a moment too long. He could feel her scrutiny, a physical pressure. He offered a weak, humorless laugh. "Something like that." She nodded slowly, then glanced into the truck bed, her eyes scanning the few dusty bags he had thrown in. Her gaze snagged on something. Reid followed it. It wasn't blood. It was a patch of earth, clinging stubbornly to the metal, a clot of black, rich soil from the cabin's grounds. It pulsed. Faintly, a subtle, almost imperceptible throb, mirroring the phantom ache in his chest. The agent's gaze sharpened, moving from the soil back to Reid's eyes. He felt a sudden, irrational panic, a desperate urge to floor the accelerator and burst through the barrier. He managed. Deep in the woods. She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's a long way from anywhere." She tapped her pen against her clipboard. You been alone out there? He nodded. Yes. The lie felt heavy. A physical object in his mouth. He hadn't been alone. He had been surrounded, consumed, altered. Stillness about you. Like the air after a storm. Or before one. He looked at the patch of earth again, then back at him. Everything all right? Reid could only stare at him, the words stuck. He understood then. The entity wasn't gone. It hadn't been contained or destroyed. It had merely been displaced. And a fragment of it, a seed, a memory, had clung to him, to the soil, to the truck, and was now traveling with him, across the border, into the world he had fought so desperately to return to. He was no longer just Reid, he was a carrier, a harbinger. The horror had simply found a new home. His home. The silence that descended upon the cabin was not a bomb, it was a deeper, more profound terror. It vibrated in Reid's bones, a hollow thrumming that echoed the emptiness where the entity had been, yet also hinted at an absence that wasn't quite complete. He stood amidst the wreckage of the living room, splintered wood and overturned furniture marking the battleground. The air hung thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust on old blood. His breath hitched, a ragged sound in the sudden, absolute quiet. Displaced, not destroyed. A fragment. He pressed a hand to his chest, as if he could physically contain the creeping unease, but it was already a part of him, a new layer beneath his skin. Reid moved with the stiff, uncoordinated grace of a marionette whose strings had been cut and hastily retied. He didn't pack. There was nothing to take, nothing he wanted to carry from this place. He simply walked out, leaving the door ajar, a silent invitation for the elements to reclaim what man had built and horror had corrupted. He drove, the old truck rattling over the uneven track, the sounds of the engine a jarring intrusion after the suffocating quiet. Every rustle in the leaves, every creak of the aging vehicle, sent a jolt through him. Hours bled into a haze of white-knuckled driving. The world outside the forest felt alien, too bright, too loud. He saw other vehicles, distant houses, the faint hum of power lines, and it was all a cacophony. The mandatory barrier of the border checkpoint loomed ahead, a series of concrete barriers and a small, sterile booth. A uniformed official, stout and impassive, stepped out, motioning for Reid to stop. The sudden, forced interaction was a shock. Reid had forgotten how to speak, how to interact. His throat felt dry, his tongue thick. "Passport, please," the official said, his voice clipped in routine. Reid fumbled in his glove compartment, his hands trembling slightly as he retrieved the document. The official took it, his eyes scanning the photo, then flicking up to Reid's face. Reid could feel the man's gaze linger, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Had he seen it? Reid merely nodded, unable to form words. The official handed back the passport, his gaze still fixed on Reid. "All right, then. Drive safe." Reid pulled away, the official's words echoing in his mind. Rough patch. It was an understatement so profound it felt like a new form of mockery. He had not merely been through a rough patch, he had been through the crucible, witnessing the true face of ancient malice, uncovering a lineage of sacrifice, and escaping a horror that had transcended time. He had broken the pact, yes, prevented the ultimate consumption, but at what cost? He drove on, the sun climbing higher, baking the asphalt. It was a parasitic force, one that sought connection, a conduit. And in doing so, he had, perhaps, become its new, unwitting vessel. They had understood the necessity of sacrifice, the delicate balance of containing such a thing. Reid, in his desperate fight for survival, had disrupted that balance. He was free of the cabin, but not of its legacy. The horror had not consumed him, but it had indelibly marked him. He was a survivor, yes, but also a carrier.